November 3rd, 1944. Early morning, somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales. The lorry rattled to a stop on a narrow lane bordered by dry stone walls. Frost clung to the grass and mist hung low over the hills, turning the landscape into layers of gray and white. The German prisoners climbed down stiffly, their breath clouding in the cold air, boots crunching on gravel still wet from overnight rain. They had crossed the channel expecting punishment, confinement, perhaps cruelty born of years of bombing and loss. What they found instead made them pause mid-step. A man stood, 50 yards up the hillside, leaning on a long wooden staff, a black and white collie sitting alert at his heel. He wore a flat cap pulled low, a heavy wool jacket darkened by weather, and trousers tucked into mudded boots. Behind him, sheep grazed across the slope, their bleating carried on the wind. He wasn't guarding them. He was simply watching, the way a shepherd watches anything that moves through his valley. One prisoner, a failed weeble from the 352nd Infantry Division, squinted through the mist and muttered to the man beside him. Schaffer, shepherd, but not the kind they knew from Bavaria or Saxony. This man belonged to the land in a way that seemed older than the war, older than nations. He stood perfectly still, staff planted in the earth, dog motionless beside him, both waiting with a patience that felt almost ancient. The British corporal in charge of the detail gestured up the lane. "Right then, let's get you lot salted." His tone was neither warm nor cold, just matter of fact, the clipped efficiency of a man with work to do and weather coming in. As the column moved forward, the shepherd raised 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. A small acknowledgement, nothing more, then turned and walked up the hillside, the collie moving at his command with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The failed weeble watched him disappear into the mist. He had expected towers, machine guns, concrete. Instead, he found hills, sheep, and a man who carried authority not in a uniform, but in the quiet way he commanded the land itself. If this is England, it is not the England we were told to destroy. If you want to hear stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the war, subscribe now. We're uncovering history one forgotten moment at a time. They had been warned what captivity in Britain would mean. The propaganda had been relentless. England was starving, desperate, vengeful. German prisoners would be worked to exhaustion in bombed-out cities, fed nothing but scraps, beaten by guards whose families had died in the Blitz. Some whispered that the British, driven mad by years of bombardment, would show no mercy to those who had rained fire on London, Coventry, and Liverpool. The officers had been clear during the crossing: expect nothing, demand nothing, survive however you can. Yet as the lorry wound through the Dales, the prisoners saw something they hadn't anticipated. The countryside was intact. Stone farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys, fields divided by ancient walls, sheep grazing peacefully, valleys untouched by war. The cities might be burning, but here in the hills, life continued as it had for centuries. The lorry pulled into a camp carved into a former army training ground. Rows of Nissen huts, barbed wire perimeter, guard posts at the corners. Simple, functional, nothing elaborate. But what struck the Feldwebel was the first sound he heard after the engine cut off. Sheep. Hundreds of them bleating in a nearby pasture. Their wool thick for winter, their movement slow and unbothered. The sound was so ordinary, so utterly civilian, that for a moment he forgot where he was. A guard, middle-aged, weathered face, rifle slung loosely, waved them toward the processing hut. "Queue up. Medical first, then you'll get sorted." The words were clipped, practical. No malice, no triumph, just instruction. Inside the hut, a medical officer examined each man in turn. He asked questions in slow, deliberate English. A camp interpreter, a thin man with a German accent softened by years in London, translated. Any injuries? Illness? Chronic conditions? The Feldwebel hesitated, then lifted his trouser leg to show a poorly healed wound from Normandy, shrapnel that had torn through his calf and never properly closed. The medical officer leaned in, probing gently, then made a note. "We'll clean that properly. Infection's likely. We'll get you sorted." The interpreter relayed the words. The Feldwebel stared. He had expected his wound to be ignored, left to fester as punishment. Instead, the medical officer was already preparing antiseptic and fresh bandages, working with the same care he might show to a British soldier. As the bandage was wrapped, the Feldwebel closed his eyes. Why? After processing, they were marched to the mess hut. The smell hit them before they entered. Mutton stew, boiled potatoes, the yeasty warmth of fresh bread. Not white bread, like the Americans might have, but dense brown bread with a crust that cracked when you broke it. A cook in a stained apron ladled stew into tin bowls and slid them across the counter. "Go on, find a seat." No ceremony, no explanation. The prisoners took their bowls and sat at long wooden tables, staring at the food in silence. The stew was thick, fatty, rich with meat and root vegetables. The bread was coarse but filling. The tea, strong, dark, served in chipped enamel mugs, was almost bitter. One prisoner, a young grenadier from Hamburg, lifted his spoon and tasted carefully. The mutton was real. He chewed slowly, eyes closing. Another man tore into the bread, chewing mechanically, then stopped. His hands trembled slightly. He set the bread down and stared at it. "Mutter hat Monate kein echtes Brett gesehen." My mother hasn't seen real bread in months. The Feldwebel drank his tea in silence. It was strong enough to strip paint, the way working men drank it. No sugar, no milk, just tea leaves steeped until the liquid turned nearly black. He held the enamel mug in both hands, feeling its warmth seep into his palms. It was just a mug, scratched, dented, stained from years of use in army kitchens and work camps. But in that moment, it became something more. A small, ordinary object that carried the weight of everything he had expected and everything that was unraveling. Later that night, lying on his bunk in the cold Nissen hut, he thought about that mug, the way it had warmed his hands, the way the tea had burned his throat, the way no one had said a word about kindness or mercy. They had simply poured the tea and walked away. If they treat enemies this way, what lies did we believe? The days settled into a rhythm dictated not by punishment, but by work. Dawn came early in the Dales. The prisoners woke to frost on the windows and the distant bleating of sheep. Breakfast was porridge with a spoonful of jam, more of that dark tea, bread with a scraping of margarine. Plain food, but consistent. Then came work details. Some men stayed in camp, repairing huts or maintaining the grounds. Others were loaded onto lorries and driven to farms scattered across the valleys, places where the labor was desperately needed, where the young men had gone to war, and only the old, the women, and the land girls remained. The Feldwebel was assigned to a hill farm 10 miles from camp. The lorry climbed a winding track, stone walls on either side, sheep scattering as the vehicle passed. At the top of the valley sat a farmhouse, low, stone-built, with a slate roof and windows small against the wind. The farmer was waiting. He was in his 60s, lean and hard, with hands like gnarled wood and eyes that had seen 70 winters in these hills. He wore the same flat cap, the same wool jacket, the same mudded boots, as the shepherd from the first morning. He looked the prisoners over without expression, then nodded once. "Right. We're moving sheep today, down to the lower pasture before the snow comes. You'll help with the drive. Any questions?"
The interpreter translated. The prisoners shook their heads. The farmer spat into the grass and started walking. The prisoners followed. The work was unlike anything they had done in the Vermucht. No drills, no shouted orders, just the slow, deliberate movement of sheep across open hillside, guided by the farmer's dog, a border collie that moved like liquid, responding to whistles and hand signals the prisoners couldn't begin to understand. The Feldwebel stumbled on the uneven ground, his boots slipping on wet grass. The farmer watched without comment, then showed him how to position himself, how to move slowly, so the sheep flowed around him rather than scattering in panic. "Steady. Don't rush him. Let the dog do the thinking." The Feldwebel tried again. This time the sheep moved smoothly. The farmer nodded. "Aye, that'll do." Those 3 words, "that'll do," carried more weight than any medal the Feldwebel had earned. They meant competence. They meant the work mattered. They meant he was seen not as a prisoner, but as a man who could be useful. At midday, the farmer's wife appeared with a basket. She set out thick slices of bread, hard cheese, apples from the cellar, and a thermos of tea. She gestured for the prisoners to sit on the stone wall and eat. The Feldwebel hesitated. "Go on," the farmer said. "You've worked, you eat." They ate in silence, the taste of sharp cheddar and dense bread almost overwhelming. The farmer sat nearby, chewing slowly, his dog lying at his feet. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to explain something about the land, how the walls were built without mortar, how the sheep knew their territory, how weather moved through the valleys. He spoke to them the way he might speak to any hired help, not as enemies, not as prisoners, just as men doing a day's work. Over the weeks, the prisoners began to notice patterns. The guards were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were older men, reserved or exempt from combat duty, assigned to camps because they understood rural life. Some were farmers themselves, still working their own land while serving part-time guard rotations. One guard, a taciturn man named Wilkins, often stopped during work breaks to share cigarettes. He didn't say much. Yorkshire men rarely did, but his presence was steady, reassuring. He showed them how to repair dry stone walls, how to handle sheep without frightening them, how to read the weather by the color of the sky. "See that cloud? Rain within the hour. Best finish up." He was always right. Another guard, younger, told them about his brother killed at Dunkirk, buried somewhere in France. He said it without bitterness, just stating a fact, the way one might mention the price of wool or the date of shearing. "War's done what it's done, nor changing it now." The prisoners didn't know how to respond. At night, lying in their bunks, they talked in low voices. Some insisted the kindness was strategic, designed to extract information or break their will. Others admitted reluctantly that it seemed genuine. The grenadier from Hamburg said what many were thinking. "If they wanted to hurt us, they'd have done it by now." Another prisoner, a carpenter from Stuttgart, laughed bitterly. Maybe they don't need to. Maybe showing us how they live, how they endure without cruelty, that's the real defeat. The Feldwebel said nothing. He was thinking about the enamel mug from his first meal, about the farmer's 3 words of approval, about the way Wilkins had shared his tobacco without ceremony, just a brief nod before walking away. These were not the actions of men pretending. They were the actions of men who simply lived this way, with restraint, with competence, with a quiet dignity that needed no announcement. By winter, the prisoners had begun to understand the structure of their captivity. It was not designed to break them. It was designed to contain them safely while extracting labor the countryside desperately needed. The system rested on principles that seemed almost mundane in their straightforwardness. Security. Camps were fenced and guarded, but escapes were rare. Where would they go? The landscape itself was a barrier, open, unfamiliar, with local populations alert to strangers. Intelligence. Cooperation was encouraged through fair treatment. Prisoners who provided useful information about German positions or equipment were rewarded with small privileges, extra cigarettes, better work assignments. But even those who refused were not punished harshly. Reciprocity. Britain adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, knowing their own soldiers held in German camps would benefit from the precedent. Red Cross inspections were regular and documented. Complaints were logged and investigated. Necessity. Britain's farms were desperate for labor. Treating prisoners well meant they worked efficiently. It was practical, not sentimental. Morality. This was hardest for the prisoners to accept. Many British officers and farmers genuinely believed that treating prisoners humanely was simply proper conduct, not because it served strategy, but because it reflected what they considered decent behavior. The evidence supported the system. By late 1944, over 150,000 German prisoners were held in camps across Britain. Mortality rates were low, far lower than in German camps holding Allied prisoners. Food was rationed, but adequate. Work was hard, but paid. Letters home were censored for military intelligence, but otherwise allowed. The Feldwebel read about these policies in a camp newsletter typed on a mimeograph machine and distributed weekly. The words felt surreal. He thought of his wife rationing butter and coal in Hamburg. He thought of his son, barely 16, now conscripted into the Volksturm. He thought of the propaganda that had promised British barbarity. We were told lies. He realized slowly, not as revelation, but as erosion, certainties worn away by the accumulation of small, undeniable truths. Christmas 1944 arrived with snow. The Dales turned white overnight. The hills softened under heavy drifts, the stone walls marked only by dark lines against the landscape. The prisoners woke to cold that bit through the thin walls of the Nissen huts, their breath fogging in the darkness. But when they entered the mess hut that morning, something had changed. Pine branches cut from somewhere nearby had been arranged along the walls. Paper chains made by prisoners in the evenings hung from the rafters. Someone had carved a small nativity scene from scrap wood and set it on a table near the stove. At breakfast, there was extra porridge. At midday, a special meal appeared: roast mutton, potatoes, carrots, and gravy thick enough to coat the spoon. Even a small piece of Christmas pudding, dense and dark, served with a spoonful of custard. In the evening, a chaplain, a British captain with a gentle voice, held a service in the mess hut. He spoke briefly in English. The interpreter translated. Then the prisoners sang, their voices rising in the cold air, carrying the old hymn through the hut and out into the snow. Still Heiligan. The guards stood outside listening. Some removed their caps. When the song ended, Wilkins clapped once softly, then walked away into the falling snow. The Feldwebel sat on his bunk afterward, staring at the enamel mug someone had left on the shelf beside a small sprig of holly. He thought of Christmases before the war, his wife's cooking, his son's laughter, the warmth of their small apartment. He thought of what they must be enduring now: cold, hunger, fear. And he thought of this place where enemies sang hymns together and guards stood bareheaded in the snow. This is not how wars are supposed to end, but perhaps he thought that was the point. By spring 1945, the rhythms of camp life had deepened into something that felt almost ordinary. Prisoners who had once refused to learn English now spoke haltingly with guards. Men who had clung to Nazi ideology found themselves questioning quietly whether the certainties they had been taught were as solid as they had seemed. The work continued: farms, forestry, road repair. But now many prisoners took pride in their labor, competing to see who could build the straightest wall, who could move sheep most efficiently. The farmer whose land the Feldwebel worked invited him to sit on the stone wall one evening after the day's work. He poured 2 mugs of tea from a thermos and handed one over. "You've gotten good at this," the farmer said, nodding toward the hillside. "Better than some lads I've hired." The Feldwebel sipped the tea, strong and bitter, and nodded. "Danke." The farmer smiled faintly. "Thinking of staying in farming after all this?" The question caught the Feldwebel off guard. He hadn't thought about after. The war still raged somewhere beyond these hills. His future was unimaginable. But sitting there on that wall, watching the sun sink behind the fells, he allowed himself to imagine it. A small piece of land, a few sheep, a quiet life far from the ruins of what he had once believed. "Wiek," he said quietly. "Perhaps." The farmer nodded and took another sip of tea. They sat in silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared, scattered across the vast Yorkshire sky. If this story is making you see history differently, subscribe now. We're bringing you the moments textbooks never mention. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. News reached the camps in fragments. BBC broadcasts, newspaper headlines whispered rumors that hardened into certainty. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Reich was finished. The prisoners reacted in different ways. Some wept openly, mourning the sheer scale of loss. Their families, their cities, their futures. Others sat silent, staring at walls, unable to process what collapse meant. A few hardliners insisted it was Allied propaganda, that Germany would rise again, but most simply felt empty.
The Feldwebel sat on his bunk, holding a letter that had arrived weeks earlier, forwarded through Red Cross channels. His wife's handwriting, careful and shaky, told him Hamburg had been firebombed. Their apartment was gone. She and their son were living in a church basement. "We have nothing," she wrote, "but we are alive. That is enough." He folded the letter carefully and placed it under his pillow. Outside, the camp continued as it always had. Guards made their rounds. Sheep bleated in distant pastures. The enamel mug sat on the shelf beside his bunk, catching the late afternoon light. He thought about the farmer, about Wilkins, about the medical officer who had dressed his wound without hesitation. He thought about the bread, the tea, the Christmas hymn sung in a freezing hut far from home. They did not have to treat us this way. But they had. And now, returning to a Germany in ruins, he would carry that knowledge with him, a quiet, uncomfortable truth that would shape the rest of his life.
Repatriation began slowly in 1946. Trains assembled, names were called, prisoners packed their few belongings, letters, small carvings, notebooks filled with English vocabulary, and prepared to leave. Some were eager to return. Others hesitated, knowing what awaited them. Rubble, starvation, occupation, a country divided and shattered. A few asked if they could stay. British officials, bound by international agreements, explained that repatriation was mandatory. But they also noted quietly that after formal release, some men might find ways to return through immigration channels. The Feldwebel boarded a train in late summer 1946. He shook hands with Wilkins, who had driven him to the station. The guard's grip was firm, his face weathered as always. "Take care, lad." "I will, you also." Wilkins touched 2 fingers to his cap and walked away. The train pulled from the station, and the Feldwebel watched through the window as the Yorkshire countryside rolled past. Fields divided by stone walls, sheep grazing peacefully, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys. He thought about the farmer's question, thinking of staying in farming. Perhaps someday, he thought. Perhaps. Years later, in the 1950s, a curious phenomenon emerged in West Germany. Agricultural clubs formed where men studied British sheep farming techniques. Some were simply enthusiasts, but others were former POWs, men who had spent months or years working British hill farms and returned home carrying memories of a different way of managing land. They spoke carefully, aware that admitting they had been treated well by the enemy carried shame. But among themselves, in quiet moments, they shared stories of bread and tea, of work on hillsides, of guards who treated them like hired hands rather than prisoners. The Feldwebel, now working in a factory in Hamburg, joined one such club. He listened to the discussions of breeding and pasture management and felt a strange ache. When someone asked if he had experience with sheep farming, he nodded. "In England," he said, "during the war." He didn't elaborate, but that night, lying in bed, he thought about the enamel mug. He had left it behind in the camp along with everything else, but the memory remained. The weight of it in his hands, the warmth of the tea, the way it had symbolized something he still struggled to name. Restraint, competence, civilization under pressure. He wondered if the farmers still sat on stone walls in the evenings, watching the sun set over his valley. He wondered if Wilkins still walked his rounds, cap pulled low, rifles slung loose. He wondered if any of them remembered the German prisoners who had worked their land, built their walls, and quietly begun to question everything they had been taught. Historians who study the POW camps of World War II often focus on logistics, numbers of prisoners, mortality rates, labor productivity. These are important, but they miss something deeper. The camps were not just holding facilities. They were laboratories of belief. Men arrived convinced of their superiority, steeped in propaganda, certain that the enemy would be barbaric. They left, most of them, with that certainty shaken. Not destroyed necessarily, but cracked, allowing light to seep through. The British drovers, the shepherds, the farmers, they did not set out to change minds. They simply lived as they always had, working hard, speaking little, treating people with the baseline respect that came naturally to those who measured worth by competence, not ideology. And in doing so, they demonstrated something the propaganda had never prepared the prisoners for: that strength did not require cruelty, that authority did not require shouting, that civilization could endure even under the pressures of war, perhaps especially then. The Feldwebel never returned to England, but he kept a small photograph taken at the farm during one of the work details. In it, he stands beside the farmer, both men leaning on staffs, sheep visible in the background. The farmer's cap cast a shadow across his face. The Feldwebel's expression is uncertain, caught between worlds. He framed the photograph and hung it on the wall of his modest apartment. When visitors asked about it, he said only, a time I spent in the Yorkshire Dales. His son, born after the war, grew up seeing that photograph. He asked questions. The Feldwebel answered some, deflected others, but he made sure his son understood one thing. The British could have treated us cruelly. They had reason, but they did not. Remember that. It was the closest he ever came to explaining what those years had meant. The slow unraveling of certainty, the painful realization that he had been wrong, the enduring memory of men who had shown him a kind of dignity he had never known under his own flag. In the end, it was not grand gestures that changed them. It was the accumulation of small ones. An enamel mug filled with bitter tea, a farmer's 3 words of approval, a guard sharing tobacco without ceremony, a sprig of holly left beside a bunk at Christmas, a handshake offered without hesitation. These were not the tools of propaganda. They were the tools of ordinary decency, wielded by men who believed quietly, without fanfare, that even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings. The barbed wire enclosed their bodies, but it could not contain the ideas that seeped through. Ideas about dignity, restraint, and what it meant to live with integrity, even in defeat. Decades later, the children and grandchildren of those prisoners would travel to Britain, seeking the landscapes their fathers and grandfathers had described. Some would visit the sites of old camps, now repurposed, or returned to farmland. Others would drive through the Dales looking for echoes of the stories they had been told. And occasionally, very occasionally, they would meet the descendants of the guards, the farmers, the shepherds, men and women who remembered the German prisoners who had worked their family's land, who had sat on stone walls drinking tea, who had left behind small carvings and letters written in careful English. The conversations were always awkward at first, but they always ended the same way, with a handshake, a quiet acknowledgement that something profound had happened in those camps, something that transcended the war and its hatreds. Before we close, if you've made it this far, you understand why these stories matter. Subscribe and help us tell more. A shepherd's whistle carries across the valley at dusk. The sound is high and sharp, cutting through the still air, commanding the dog that moves like a shadow across the hillside. The sheep respond, flowing downward toward the fold, their movement ancient and instinctive. The shepherd stands silhouetted against the fading light, staff planted in the earth, watching his flock with the same quiet attention his grandfather's grandfather once used.
The work is done. The valley grows dark. Somewhere far away, an old man sits in a Hamburg apartment, holding a photograph and remembering the weight of an enamel mug in his hands, the taste of bitter tea, the sight of hills that stretched forever. The whistle fades, the sheep settle. The valley returns to silence. True strength, it turns out, was never in the wire, nor in the orders shouted across parade grounds. It was in the quiet competence of men who knew their work, who treated others with the dignity they themselves would expect, and who measured worth not by ideology, but by the simple fact of a job done well.